Our next talk is by video from Eric Rexstand. He earned a computer science BA from Luther College, which is in Iowa. He then earned a wildlife ecology Master's of Science from Utah State University, where I first met him. And his PhD is also in wildlife ecology from Colorado State University. After a postdoc at CSU with David, he joined the faculty at the Institute of Arctic Biology and the Department of Biology and Wildlife at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Here he rose to the rank of associate professor before being stolen by Cream over at University of St. Andrews, where he was a senior research fellow with the Center for Research in Ecological and Environmental Modeling at the University of St. Andrews. At Cream, he was a member of the distance software development team and organizer of international distance sampling training workshops. He also headed up the research unit for wildlife population assessment for a number of years, sort of their consulting arm. Did projects, grants, things like that, as well as distance sampling. He's also been a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews on statistical computing and estimating animal abundance. Eric recently told me that he officially retired this year as well. So more time to enjoy reading, hiking, and traveling. Well, not to the US. I followed Eric and Jeff Lake, who will be speaking later, to USU and CSU. Jeff had already left and was in San Diego, and Eric was in his first year. In fact, he was the one who took me around for ice cream, and you know, it's a beautiful summer day in Logan, Utah, beautiful, it's flowering, there's no students around. What the heck, it seemed like a nice place. He's going to talk about the learning experience as a graduate student with David Anderson.
Greetings, Fort Collins. As Ken said, my name's Eric Rexstand. I'm talking to you from my home here in Scotland. When Ken invited me to speak at this event, I was very happy to do so. I'll try not to take up very much of your time. What I want to do is speak about 4 sets of events in my professional life in which David played a central role. Now, most of the speakers that you have already heard from encountered David after their professional brains were reasonably well developed. In contrast, my encounters with David were at a time where my professional brain was very much in its formative stages. And what I hope to impart to you in the next few minutes is the really rather profound effect that he had upon that brain and my professional development. A little note about the slides. The slides themselves are going to be split into left sides and right sides. The left side of the slides contain exhibits, in other words, sort of mementos from these past experiences. They're not really meant for you to read. The story that accompanies the exhibits on the right-hand side is the more meaningful material on the slides. I merely put the exhibits on the left to indicate to you that what I'm describing to you are real events. So let's start at the beginning. Cast your minds back to 1980. And the place is Utah State University in Logan. I had recently arrived there as a master's student, working on a master's program with a fellow by the name of George Ennis. At Utah State, we had what were called pre-project seminars to accompany post-project seminars. The pre-project seminars were intended to have the candidate describe what they were intending to accomplish during their master's research. My work was going to be along the lines of modeling energy flow through ecosystems using a bioenergetics model. And so my pre-project seminar was devoted to sort of describing this model that you'll see here on the left and the parameters associated with that ecosystem model, which are described here on the left. My presentation was pretty short, and when it was over, unsurprisingly, the first hand that went in the air was David Anderson's. And his question was along the lines of, how are you going to estimate all of the parameters that go into this model? I stumbled and hemmed and hawed and don't really remember what I said other than I was going to get them out of the literature or something like that. He was kind and sort of left me alone at that point. But what he was really trying to do was to enlighten me about, well, if you have all of those parameters to estimate and they have uncertainty, then that uncertainty is going to propagate into the overall result that your model produces. And he wanted me to speak to that, but I couldn't because I was really new to the business and didn't really understand the question. That was my first interaction, and that's going to foreshadow subsequent interactions that I'll speak to in a moment. So fast forward to 5 years into the future. We're now around 1985, 86. David has moved on to Colorado State. I moved on to Colorado State and was now enrolled in a PhD program with David. According to my transcript, in the spring of 1987, David taught a course in multivariate statistics. Now, really, it might have more aptly been described as an anti-course rather than a course. But nevertheless, in this course, one of the assignments was for each member of the class to collect a vector of data, of whatever they wanted. And the 15 different univariate data sets were all going to be mashed together to form a data set of nonsense that we were then going to subject to a battery of different statistical procedures. This was an example of the layers of David's approach to anything, approach to issues. In this case, his approach to multivariate analysis. His proximate objective was to have the 15 students in the class understand the role and the potential for misuse of multivariate analyses in wildlife science. However, his ultimate objective was broader than that, to try to speak not only to the students in the class, but also to the profession as a whole through the Journal of Wildlife Management. With David's encouragement, some of the students in the class ran with the data that had been collected and the analyses that had been performed and produced this manuscript that we subsequently had published in JWM, speaking to the challenges of using multivariate analyses to find patterns where patterns don't necessarily exist. Moving to the other side of the classroom, while I was at Colorado State, I was invited to be the teaching assistant in the famous or infamous FW663. And one of the defining features of FW663 were the quizzes that happened nearly every day. And these quizzes, as this description says, were intended to try to get feedback from the students to find out what messages were not being clearly communicated by the instructors. These quizzes came together every day at lunch after the course had been taught in the morning. David and Gary White and I would go to the student center, where all of you are, and formulate the quizzes for the next day. Now, in the past, I had been on the receiving end of these quizzes, but this was my first opportunity to be on the delivery end of them. And in that fashion, I was able to learn how questions were going to be used as tools in part of the learning experience. It wasn't meant as a form of torture for the students. It was meant to try to encourage students to absorb the material that they were being exposed to, not just have it flow over them. Beyond the development of those quizzes, I was also given the opportunity to help prepare the midterm exam. And David and Gary sort of said to me, all right, why don't you put together question number 3? And so that's what I did. I put together question number 3, which is presented here. Again, don't worry about reading what it says. But the result of developing the midterm exam question, again, had a dual purpose. Not only did we present the midterm question to the students and get their feedback, it was further developed into a talk that I gave at an American Fisheries Society symposium, the proceedings of which were subsequently published. So again, as part of the learning experience, the learning didn't stop at the quote-unquote walls of the classroom, but instead they expanded beyond the walls of the classroom into the profession in general. My last reminiscence is of a Davidism. And whenever I would come into his office during my PhD program and say, here's what I found out, I would invariably be greeted by, well, how do you know? How do you know that you know? And again, much like the pre-project seminar back in Logan many years before, I was sort of baffled. I didn't understand the question. How do you know you know? What does that mean? So his questions always tended to exceed my ability to grasp them. In reality, what he was asking me to do was he was asking me to look at issues from perspectives that I hadn't necessarily thought about looking at them from previously. And so he wanted me to appreciate, because difficult questions don't have obvious or known answers, you have to dig for them, and you have to be able to acknowledge that your certainty about your finding is going to be dictated largely by the certainty associated with the methodology that you employed to find that answer. And David tried to reinforce that whole perspective of looking at questions from a different point of view during my PhD comprehensive exam. Because David really thought about how science got done. So again, here's an exhibit. I don't expect you to try to read it, but it was one of the questions that he asked me during my comprehensive exam. The main feature of which is at the bottom of the question. He said, what he instructed me to do was try to come up with an answer to this question, not from reinforcement in the biological literature, not from analyzing these data in a statistical perspective, but what he said was, go look at the philosophy literature and address the question from a philosophical perspective and try the contentions that I made in my answer from the philosophy literature. And so that's another example of the breadth of David's perspective in tackling problems that he tried to pass along to me. So those are just a few reminiscences that I have about the time I spent with David. I appreciate you listening to what I had to say, and I now toss it back to Ken Wilson.
Dave loved to also give you a book. There's a book by Goldstein and Goldstein, Philosophy of Science book. It's called How You Know, something like that. And that book goes through examples in the history of different science, getting back at this, how do you know what you know? And so he was very good at finding that stuff and asking that question about 40 million different ways. I wasn't going to be on the docket talking about something, but my wonderful friend and colleague were sandwiched by 3 grad students who were housed over here together with David working on PhD. But Eric said, my talk's not long enough. And so I'm the one I can squeeze mine down and adjust. And, there's cookies sitting out there. And so I'm just going to go eat cookies. No. I'll quickly say, okay, so my degrees are a Bachelor of Science at UC Davis in Wildlife and Fisheries, and then at Utah State University in Wildlife Science, and then my PhD is from CSU, and back then it was a Fisheries and Wildlife, now Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. I followed my 2 fellows again to their respective schools a little after them. Eric was here. Jeff had probably just started when I arrived, maybe in that same year. Eric got out first. I got out my PhD second. The brilliant Lake, and I do mean brilliant, was after us. That's because he really had the equivalent of a stat. He had taken every graduate level stat course except the 711 probability theory. He loved to come back to the office, to the whiteboard, and harass Eric and I with some problem he was trying to do where he'd go, this is the lymph soup of the whatever, and we would sit there and nod, and he would go through and solve it, and we'd go, why does he do that to us? But, he decided just to get a PhD while all 3 of us, I got them to install the first PC computer network, ArcNet, on campus in our building. We ran it. We were the consultants. He wrote Program Distance and a PhD and was married and had 2 kids. So that's his fault. He was always underpaid and overworked. He isn't now. So I'll briefly talk a bit about another aspect of this because they're going to cover, what David was like as a graduate advisor and mentor to not only his own students, but I'll talk about the elephant in the room. I'm a black guy. As I do often over my career, I can look around the room and, this is unique. There's more than one person in this room of color, And that's been my career. And I was planning on sort of talking about that, But I was also struck by, I got an email that made me even think about it a little deeper. I got an email from a grad student in our department asking if they felt uncomfortable because there were no women on the docket here. And, you know, I went about it logically, and I said, yeah, there really wouldn't be a black guy here if I hadn't been a student. But who did Dave work with? I came in the field at a time when I saw women blossoming and beginning to the point where now in our department, they're more than 50-50 at the undergraduate and the graduate level. So it was like, and I appreciate it. The comeback was, oh, I hadn't thought about that. But I also reflected on the fact that one of his first associations, a seminal paper that goes back to the mid-1970s, published in 1978. Actually, if you find it, you'll find the second edition, Brownie et al. Cavell Brownie was the first, from what I've read, the first African-American statistician, PhD, in the US. North Carolina State University. I sent her an email. I've never, I think I might have met her, but I've never met her. I heard about her from David. You know, brilliant statistician, and he worked with her. I've never seen Dave talk about any animosity, but I also stopped and said, did Dave have any women graduate students? I do know of one who was accepted and didn't make it, but why over his career did he not have more? Don't know. Be a fun question to ask David. You know, I know you had to meet certain criteria. I asked him finally when I got up the courage somewhere towards the end of my PhD, why me? You know, why did my sister tell me when I came back from a backpacking trip, hey, some guy in Utah called you and wants you to fly out and talk about grad school? Why did I apply to Utah State? Fortuitously, because a professor was visiting at UC Davis who taught scientific writing, and he taught a great class, and he said, you should apply out there. Didn't visit it until I was invited. And my mentors at University of California, Davis, I went to him, I said, who is this guy? And what was their comment? You stick up for what you know when you go out to talk to this guy. Because they knew him from the waterfowl world in the bird banding meetings, which were quite contentious in the different districts. But they said he's a great guy, smart, intelligent, and he was, you know. But he did, in answering that question, he says, well, first, you know, I look for students who have this quantitative ability because that's what he was working on. I had started out as an engineering major, so I took calculus for math majors, and back then, with the cards, Fortran, like a program. And then, because I guess I was a little bit of a nerd, I found that basic stats class fun and took 2 more. So he glommed onto that. What pisses me off is I heard that he wasn't a good student in high school. I rebelled in ornithology at UC Davis and got a C. What did he make me retake in my graduate program? Ornithology. Bored as heck in there, but I got an A, you know. And when I see him again, I will tell him about that. But so he then said, and, you know, the federal government right now is trying to change the dynamics of the workforce, is trying to get more diverse individuals there. They were a little ahead of, I think, universities in that end. Well, I know they were. So there were some funds around, and he was good at finding funds. And I learned from that, I think, from being later on a department head in leadership. You better take, when you have that opportunity, because you know, you could ask the question, well, why didn't he sort of find another African-American student? Yeah, good luck. There aren't many. On the other hand, there were quite a few women coming along into the late 70s and 80s and 90s. I know he didn't take very many grad students. Dave doesn't have this huge resume. He started with 2 postdocs when he became a faculty. I don't know the answer to that question, but I also know some of my colleagues here in the room who I went to school with and have worked with, you know, I never heard from them, and they were quite vocal in the sort of women's lib way. If Dave had been someone who was like saying something behind the doors and not treating women right, I think they would have said that. And I've never felt or heard anything that he wouldn't do that. The part of this that, and I doubt that grad student is in the room, but in my letter I wrote back because what came out of that is something that's going on right now in our society. They said they felt uncomfortable coming to this knowing there were no women. And my response was, I would have never gone to a meeting over my entire career if I felt uncomfortable. Thankfully, I was an Air Force brat where it is a little more mixed. My father took the opportunity to do that. And I had a talk and slides here, but I can just say that he would have been, you know, looking at opportunities in Southern California in the black neighborhood, and they weren't there. He charged off and did well and got as far as he could in 20 and a half years to E9, which is incredible. And he said, go do good things. Of course, many a times, he and my mom would say, again, you're going to school, you did well for be a park ranger? I finally succumbed and said, yes, a park ranger. They liked it when I became a professor. At least they could tell people he's a professor at a university. But park ranger was not it. And wildlife biologist was, what the heck is that, you know? So I just want to say I appreciate the fact that he was taking advantage of something that he was willing to invest in and take a chance on to try and change the dynamics of the field. And I've had a wonderful career because of that. He was here earlier. He did have a Hispanic male student. Andrew Archuleta was here. Unfortunately, to show you how well Andrew has done, earlier this year, he was appointed the Wyoming director of BLM for the state of Wyoming, and he, of course, had to run off for an afternoon meeting. So he did try and make a difference in terms of doing that, and that's something I do appreciate. But it's still a long ways to go. In terms of women in the profession, it's changing rapidly, not fast enough, and there's still a long ways to go. The first female faculty was 6 months before me, and she wishes she could be here. And that was Pat Kennedy, who's now went on to a career at Oregon State because Gary White chairs her off. No. I knew I could get him there. He did not. She respected all the faculty here, which is great. So let's take a break, and then we come back, and there's a couple of talks, Jeff Flake and Jim Nichols to finish this up. And I appreciate you all hanging out here. So, see you.